everyone. The project's name is Markov Blanket of Diabetes, a network model. It is done by Sean Grimm and Arsha Firdos for the course HAP 823 under Professor Dr. Alime. In this presentation, we are going to discuss about the background of the selection of the topic and the methodology done to get the network modeling of the diabetes. Um, the age or the age group or cohort decided for this project is 20 to 30 years old. This was done due to the literature found below. Diabetes is the third most prevalent severe chronic disease of childhood and a leading cause of retinopathy, nephropathy, neuropathy, and coronary and peripheral vascular disease later in life. Diabetes diagnosed in youth, defined as age less than 18 years, and young adults, is not always easy to classify into one of the main etiologic types, that is type 1 or type 2. The prevalence of diabetes in US youth in 2009 was 2.2 per 1,000 overall. The prevalence of type 1 diabetes was 1.93 per 1,000, and of that of type 2 diabetes was 0.24 per 1,000. Hispanic white youth had the highest prevalence of type 1 diabetes, followed by non-Hispanic black youth. Type 2 diabetes was found to occur in all racial or ethnic groups, but the proportion of type 1 to type 2 diabetes varied greatly by race or ethnicity, with type 2 diabetes representing only 5.5% of cases of diabetes in non-Hispanic white youth, 80% diabetes in American Indian youth. Between 2001 and 2009, a 31% increase in prevalence of type 2 diabetes and 21% increase in prevalence of type 1 diabetes were observed. Among the US population overall, crude estimates for 2019 were 1.6 million adults aged 20 years or older, or 5.7% of all US adults with diagnosed diabetes reported both having type 1 diabetes and using insulin. Diabetes is usually more commonly seen in middle-aged or older adults, but with the rise of obesity in children, it is now also being diagnosed in young people. This study, done by Felboer, provides timely prevalence figures of diabetes occurring in young people aged 0 to 30 in the second largest metropolitan district in England. These data are an important requirement for health service planning. Now we talk about the methodology. This research project aims to create a causal network model for diabetes using the NIHS All of Us database. We use the All of Us database to identify individuals with diabetes and other related conditions. The methodology involves using lasso regressions and temporal analysis to identify the sequence of events and create a network structure. We then perform lasso regressions to identify significant predictors of diabetes. We also use temporal analysis to establish the sequence of events leading up to diabetes. Next, we use the lasso regression to estimate the parameters of the network and calculate the predicted value for all combinations of the parents in the Markov blanket of the regression response variables. The discussion focuses on the clusters of conditions that predict the response variable, and the results demonstrate the estimated parameters of the network. Finally, we entered the parameters into Netica tables to draw the network.
Hello everyone, this is Sean, and I'm going to be talking from here on out about our presentation on diabetes. So the slide in front of us, we have the temporal sequencing code. So you can see in the first line, I'm just going to go over it very quickly. We initialize the dictionary, then we loop through the data frame to store the person ID, and then we append the condition, the start condition time, and the source concept code. And this code basically gives us our temporal sequencing that we can then use to do the pairwise counts, which I'll show you in the next slide. Okay, and then so using the temporal sequencing from the previous slide, we create a new dictionary for the pairwise counts. We iterate through that to then create our pairwise counts and sort them in descending order. Then we print the pairwise counts, and this helps us to establish the sequence of occurrence. And then, yeah, you can see at the very bottom, we print the pairs with the highest counts at the top, and we descend downwards. And this is an example of what the output looks like. It's very large, so I just copied the very top to show the ICD codes and the occurrence of how often they occur. We have to exclude the person IDs from all of us. So yeah, here's the output. Next, to get into the lasso regressions. So this is an example of the code that we used for the initial regression to determine our statistically significant variables. We used basically the same code for each of the other indirect regressions, just with some minor tweaking. So you can see that in the top, the X and the Y, for this we have determined our most frequently occurring diagnoses in the X, and also the demographic variables that we decided to include, and then Y, our response variable diabetes. You can see that there, and then we run the regression, and I'll show you what we found in the next slide. Okay, so here are the results of the first lasso regression. You can see the statistically significant variables. Now we're going to talk a little bit about that previous slide, but more specifically jump into the indirect lasso regressions and break down what each diagnosis code is as well. So the first indirect regression was obesity, or E66.01. And after running this as the response variable against all of the preceding diagnoses, we determined that these came up as the statistically significant variables. And in the following slides, I'll show you the other ones. In this slide, we can see the regression, indirect lasso regression run for unspecified asthma, which is J45.909, and these came up as the statistically significant variables. Okay, so nausea, or R11.2, was the third regression that we ran, and these are the statistically significant variables that came up non-zero. Major depressive disorder, or F32.9. These were the statistically significant variables. Anxiety disorder, or F41.9. These were the determined statistically significant variables after running the lasso. Hyperglycemia, or R73.9. These were the variables that came up as non-zero. For the female variable, which was statistically significant in the initial regression, these were the variables that came up as significant when we ran female as the response variable. For Asian as the response variable, these were the statistically significant variables. And lastly, for white, these were the statistically significant variables after running white as the response variable in the indirect lasso regression. Okay, now we're going to move on to the network modeling portion of the presentation. So as you can see here, this was the initial step that we had to take to figure out how to draw the network after running all the lasso regressions. I did this in Excel, and you can see the yellow are the statistically significant coefficients that remained that were then used to calculate the parameters for the network model. And everything that was grayed out, either some of the cells that are in a darker gray shade they had values, but then were grayed out after removing cycles. And then the lighter gray values that are on the demographic, the lower, the bottom half, and then the right side, um, they were either demographic or you can see hyperglycemia doesn't have any. I decided to remove the demographic because we assume that female, or we assume that gender, race, they occur at birth, so they occur before any of these. So decided to leave them out and just focus on the ICD codes. So next, this slide shows the Python code that we used to calculate the joint distributions. This one particularly was used for obesity, but you have to run this code for each individual variable. So you can see the coefficients that were significant that were in the table of the last slide were unspecified asthma, nausea with vomiting, major depressive disorder, and anxiety disorder. And that's specific to obesity. And then after inputting that, it will give you this code will give you a CSV file, which you can then use to calculate the probabilities for the node, for that particular node. So this one is for the obesity node. So after doing that for each variable, this is the network that we built. There are no cycles in this network. You can see that obesity is a parent of diabetes, unspecified asthma is a parent of nausea, obesity, and diabetes. Major depressive disorder is a parent of obesity, hyperglycemia, anxiety, and diabetes. Nausea is a parent of just diabetes. Hyperglycemia is only a parent of diabetes. And I can't remember if I said anxiety, but anxiety is a parent of obesity and diabetes. Or yeah. And for the demographic variables on the right-hand side, decided to leave these to not include the joint distribution because of the implication that these are at birth, and therefore they don't cause the conditions. So data quality is the first limitation. This means that accuracy and completeness of the data could affect the results. For instance, if some participants didn't provide accurate information about their health or lifestyle, it could lead to biased results. Second, we have generalizability. This refers to how the study was based on data from the participants in the United States, and the findings might not be applicable to other populations or countries. Thirdly, model assumptions. So lasso regression assumes that there's a linear relationship between the dependent variable and the predictors. So if this assumption isn't met, then the model results might be unreliable. Fourth, causality. So while the study identifies variables that are associated with diabetes, it can't establish direct causality. Further research would probably be needed to determine whether these predictors actually cause diabetes. And lastly, missing data. So the All of Us data set might have missing data, which could affect the model's accuracy and generalizability. The missing data can be caused by various factors, such as participants' failure to answer certain questions, incomplete or inaccurate information provided, and technical issues related to data collection or storage. The missing data could result in an incomplete sample, which may not accurately represent the population. Although the All of Us research program has implemented various strategies to minimize missing data, including quality checks, participant engagement, and data imputation methods. Despite these efforts, missing data might still be a potential limitation. So in conclusion, our study used temporal analysis and lasso regression to identify a set of variables that are associated with diabetes. The variables that emerged as parents of diabetes in the Markov blanket include major depressive disorder, asthma, obesity, hyperglycemia, nausea, anxiety, and these last three, which technically we didn't include, but I feel like it's interesting to include them maybe for further research is the demographic variables white, female, and Asian. Could be used for further studies to research demographic relationship to these conditions. Our findings suggest that there are complex interrelationships among these variables, with major depressive disorder serving as a parent of several other conditions, these being asthma, anxiety, nausea, and hyperglycemia. Asthma was also found to be a parent of nausea and obesity, and anxiety was a parent of asthma, obesity, and nausea. And lastly, the implications of these findings are significant, highlighting the need for integrated approaches to the prevention and management of diabetes and its parent conditions. Though our study has several limitations, including the potential data quality issues, and the generalizability of our results to other populations and countries, future research could focus on validating our findings in other populations and exploring the causal relationship among these variables. So this concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for watching.